So good morning, everyone. Welcome. I want to talk this morning about ethics in kind of a broad sense as it relates to our practice and to the path. No matter how advanced our practice is or how much progress we've made, I have learned, certainly, and sometimes the hard way, that we're never beyond the need to be careful and grounded in how we behave. Meditation, ritual study, all the beautiful and profound aspects of the Dharma, none of it exempts us from the very human tendency to act out of impulse, out of fear, out of ego. And because these tendencies are so persistent in our species, ethics becomes not just an entry point to our practice, but a really steady backbone that holds it all together. We sometimes romanticize spiritual life as if waking up and seeing life more clearly means we overcome our rough edges and become effortlessly wise and kind. But in reality, I just don't think that happens. As long as we're still human, as long as we're human beings navigating the challenges of daily life, like this morning on May 27th, whatever our respective challenges are, we are still capable of saying the wrong thing, making incorrect assumptions, hurting someone without intending to, convincing ourselves we're right when we're absolutely wrong. No level of spiritual attainment really immunizes us from day to day human foolishness, which is why we need to remain vigilant, especially of the ego's mischief. It's precisely why traditional Buddhist teachings always emphasize ethical conduct as the first training. It is foundational. Without it, we can really get off the rails pretty quickly. Without a grounding in ethics, the rest of it can get wobbly really fast. And the tricky part is this: our spirituality, our progress on the path gets hijacked without our even noticing it. Ego doesn't always show up simply as arrogance. It shows up in lots of other mischievous ways. Sometimes it appears as this quiet conviction that I'm beyond the ordinary rules, that I can fudge a little bit here. Self-interest via the ego sneaks in and frames itself as, oh, that's just my intuition. Or ulterior motives hide behind expressed good intentions. Self-deception whispers clever reasons in our ear to avoid responsibility. I mean, the list goes on and on. One of the things I used to see when I was working was, narcissism putting on spiritual clothing and talking about my practice and my progress and my insight and my special path. So with all of that and more, if we're not anchored in ethics, all of this can run the show while we are still feeling above it and very spiritual about the whole thing. Now, that said, let me be clear that ethics isn't about guilt or punishment. This is a very forgiving tradition in that way. In a Buddhist context, ethics is simply understanding the difference between wholesome and unwholesome actions. I mean, that's where we can boil it down to that. And then doing our best, not perfectly, but doing our best to choose wholesome acts. It's not metaphysical. It's not abstract. It's very practical. A wholesome action, when we step back and look at it, supports clarity. It supports compassion. It supports harmony. It supports wholesome acts. It supports well-being. Whereas an unwholesome act, and we see this in the response, feeds confusion, feeds conflict, feeds greed, feeds anger, feeds fear, on and on and on. And we see that in terms of the response to unwholesome actions. Over time, whether we choose the wholesome or the unwholesome path, our actions lay down habits of mind. And these habits of mind begin to shape our character and the world we create and justify and the stories that we build around ourselves. So, what does this look like in real life? That's a little bit abstract. Well, let's think about the following. Let's say that we're in a difficult conversation with a friend. We feel misunderstood. We may even feel criticized or diminished. An unwholesome act in that context would be reactivity. We raise our voice. We get defensive. We twist the facts. We make a snarky, passive aggressive comment, whatever. We want to repair the wound that the ego has just suffered. But a wholesome action there might be really different. Take a breath, take a pause, notice the tightness in my chest. Try to respond with honesty, try to respond with calm. Now, it doesn't mean I get it right every time, and I probably don't. I know I don't actually, but it means my intention is to act in a wholesome manner. Now, again, this doesn't mean I'm letting someone walk all over me. It's not about that. It just means I'm trying to stay rooted in awareness and of wholesomeness and goodwill. Or let's take another example. A coworker gets credit for something we did. Now, the unwholesome impulse might be to go behind their back, to badmouth them, to just stew in that resentment, just ruminate about it. But a wholesome response might be simply clarifying the situation with a supervisor in a straightforward way, or just making sure we speak up for ourselves in a skillful way without malice, or choosing just to let it go if that's the wiser course for that particular moment. Ethics is not about being a saint. None of us are going to achieve sainthood in this lifetime. It is about, and let me say this with emphasis, it is about being mindful of the results that our actions create. We could call that karma. It is being mindful of the results our actions will create. It is acting with intention, knowing, uh, bringing mindfulness so that we know what the results might be. Even in small moments, the urge to cut in a line or exaggerate a story or scroll on our phone while someone is talking. Ethics sneaks into all of that. Tiny decisions may not seem like part of our spiritual path, but they are, because they're creating these habits of the mind. They shape the mind no less than meditation does. Sometimes even more so, I would argue. I've come to think of ethics as the everyday expression of wisdom, not as a lofty philosophical set of insights, but the ability to see clearly what leads to suffering versus what leads to well-being. That's sort of how I like to define wisdom. Seeing clearly the things that cause suffering and the things that cause well-being, and then acting accordingly. You could say ethics is wisdom in action. It's wisdom with legs under it. One of the areas where the ego loves to hijack our spirituality and our minds is in the realm of our judging minds. We meditate for 45 minutes in the morning, and suddenly the people who don't meditate seem, oh, they're a little less conscious. They're just not as far along as I am, or they don't get it. Or we do a silent retreat, or we read some profound teaching and start to feel like we're operating at a higher level, that we're better than others. This kind of thing happens to all of us, almost all of us anyway, at some point. And I'm not saying it to shame us or to say we should be ashamed of it, but that we should be aware of it. Awareness, 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 because this type of spiritual ego is one of the quickest ways to undermine the heart of our practice. Ethics invites us to ask, how am I treating the people in my life? Am I humble? Am I patient? Am I honest? Am I considerate? Do I listen to them with all of me? I mean, these are not easy things. And again, I'm not suggesting we get it perfectly. I'm saying these are our intentions. Because these very questions bring us down to earth. They create a certain degree of humility, and this is where actual change happens. Many of you are familiar with the five lay precepts, at least out of the Theravada tradition: non-harming, honesty, not stealing, sexual responsibility, and avoiding intoxicants. And they're often dismissed as, oh, so basic or beginner level guidelines, sort of kindergarten Buddhism. But in practice, they turn out to be pretty darn challenging. There are not rigid rules, they're not commandments, but they are skillful means which we aspire to. They help create the conditions when we are focused on the precepts just as guidelines, as foundational. They create conditions for greater clarity, for a more trustworthy heart. Because without these even basic conditions of the precepts, deeper insights get distorted. For instance, take the precept of honesty. Most people think of honesty as not telling big lies, but honesty means also noticing the little ways we shape conversations, we distort things to soften the truth, to avoid discomfort, to exaggerate, to make ourselves look good. The ego loves to manipulate and control our narratives. And ethical practice helps us see these patterns clearly, so we can begin to try to move away from them. Again, with kindness, without harsh judgment if we're not, you know, getting there every time. Non-harming is another one. It doesn't mean just don't go punch somebody in the nose. It means being aware of how our tone of voice affects others. Is my tone of voice snarky? How my silence might be hurtful if I withdraw from you, how my decisions ripple outward onto others. These are the subtleties of ethical behavior. Sometimes non-harming means speaking up. Sometimes it means stepping back. There are no hard and fast rules. We have to bring discernment to these situations so we make the best decision. But it always means paying attention, awareness. Sexual responsibility can be equally complex. It's not just about avoiding the extremes of misconduct. It's about engaging in relationships with honesty, with mutual respect, with care, without some hidden life that we're, engaging in on the internet or something. It's not about using affection or intimacy to manipulate our partner or fill emotional gaps. Ethics asks us to look deeply into our motivations. And every time we do that, I promise you, we're going to bump into the ego. Every time we look deeply into our motivations, there it sits. Even the precept on intoxicants goes way beyond alcohol or drugs. Most people take it at that level. But in our modern life, intoxicants, there's a range of them. Things that distract us, the digital noise, our phones, self-importance, ideological certainty, all these things we get addicted to, if you will. Ethical awareness helps us notice what dulls our discernment. Because if we don't want to face it, we're gonna just tune it out. When we practice ethics consistently, something interesting happens. Life becomes simpler. Not necessarily easier, but clearer. There's less chaos, there's less confusion, there's more clarity. There's less energy justifying our unskillful actions. Fewer apologies are needed. Fewer crises erupt out of nowhere. We start to trust ourselves because we're no longer operating from this fog of impulse or out of this fog of self-deception or this fog of ignorance that we talked about on Saturday. There's clarity. And others begin to trust us because they see the clarity. Not because we're perfect, we're never going to get there, but because we're trying. We're trying our best to be conscious. We're trying our best to be sincere in how we move through the world. Relationships, I tell you, benefit enormously from ethical practice because when we're committed to honesty, to kindness, responsibility, those things deepen our connection to others because conflicts are handled more calmly. There's less drama. Communication improves. Mutual respect grows. Ethics make intimacy safer for us and for others because boundaries are clear. That creates a safer relationship space. Ethics also shapes how we relate to the larger world. When we act from wholesome intentions, we lessen the harm we cause in the world, the harm that just comes from being alive, from consuming, from using resources. We contribute to the well-being of our communities. We become slightly more reliable, slightly more helpful, slightly steadier. And by golly, does the world need folks like that? Not perfect people, just consistent people, people that are trying, that have this on the forefront of their lives. And this consistency gives our practice depth. Yes, meditation and the study of the Dharma expand our awareness, but ethical conduct stabilizes it. Let me say that again because it's really important. Meditation and Dharma study expand our awareness, but ethical conduct stabilizes it. You know, the metaphor I like here is that without ethics, our spiritual practice becomes like a balloon with a slow leak. It looks full for a moment, but it gradually deflates. With ethics, our practice, the balloons doesn't leak. Our practice gains integrity. We become the kind of person whose very presence with others is calming, is grounding, is safe. So I would suggest if you want to gauge how your practice is going, how your path is going, don't look for sort of mystical experiences or, unusual states of mind. Simply look at your actions with clarity. So those are some thoughts this morning. I want just a couple other thoughts. We want to look how we behave when we're tired, when we're stressed, when we're annoyed. Look at whether we keep our word with others. Look at how we treat people who can't do anything for us in return. There's no reciprocity. There's no quid pro quo. It's not transactional. It's based in compassion. Look at the wake we leave behind us. Ethics is where the Dharma becomes real. It is where spirituality transitions from something we simply talk about to something we actually live. It's not glamorous, it's not flashy, but by golly, it is transformative. And it's available to every one of us in every moment right here, right now. So that's some ethics this morning. So let us talk about it.